Great. Welcome everyone to this event made possible by the Black Studies Center at the University of Wyoming. My name is Maya Togo Nana. I'm a graduate student in American Studies at the University of Wyoming. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Reverend Roger McDaniel of the Highland Presbyterian Church in Cheyenne, who will be introducing today and welcoming our special guests.
Thank you, Maya. Glad to be here. This is sponsored jointly by Highlands Presbyterian Church of Cheyenne, University of Wyoming Black Studies Center, and the Evangelism Church and Leader Development Committee of the Presbytery of Wyoming. And I might start by saying that Highlands is what Presbyterians call a Matthew 25 church, which in part means that we have committed ourselves to learning about and speaking out against systemic racism. And so the purpose of the program today is in part to address that commitment that we've made. Dr. William Yu is with us tonight. He's an associate professor of American religious and cultural history. Dr. Yu has written about transnational histories of American Protestant world missions in Korea and Korean American immigrant religious communities, as well as the histories of Presbyterianism and Protestant theological education in the United States. What caught my attention was his recent book that is entitled, What Kind of Christianity? A History of Slavery and Anti-Black Racism in the Presbyterian Church. So his current research interests include tracing the histories of racial injustice, settler colonialism, and slavery in the United States, and examining indigenous, Black, and Asian American theologies of freedom and resistance, and the role of the church in slavery and anti-Black racism. So we're happy to have you here tonight. Dr. Yu, it's all yours.
Thank you, Reverend McDaniel. Thank you to the Highlands United Presbyterian Church, and thank you to the University of Wyoming Black Studies Center as well. It is good to be with you all virtually. And thank you to Toby for helping out behind the scenes on StreamYard. So Toby, I am going to move to the slides that accompany my presentation and put it in full screen mode. So I think everyone can see that. I can't see you all while I'm in full screen mode, so feel free to just shout out and let me know if there are any problems along the way. What I envision doing here is for about hopefully no more than 25 minutes, doing a presentation about the book that Pastor McDaniel introduced me with, What Kind of Christianity? And from there, I hope to open it up with panelists and with everyone for the remaining 25 to 30 minutes, just for a generative time for us to discuss, learn from one another, and talk together about the possibilities, the challenges, the insights, and reflections around studying the churches, and in this particular case, the Presbyterian churches, active complicity in anti-Black racism and slavery and the legacy of this history. Katie Geneva Cannon, a womanist theologian, and the first African-American woman to be ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1974, once asked, quote, "Where was the church and the Christian believers when Black women and Black men, Black boys and Black girls were being raped, sexually abused, lynched, assassinated, castrated, and physically oppressed? What kind of Christianity allowed white Christians to deny basic human rights and simple dignity to Blacks, these same rights which had been given to others without question?" End quote. In 1836, approximately 250 commissioners from across the northern and southern states gathered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for the annual meeting of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, PCUSA hereafter, the largest Presbyterian denomination in the nation, with over 2,800 congregations and nearly 220,000 members. One of the matters these Presbyterians would grapple with was their church's position on the enslavement of more than 2 million Black persons. It would neither be the first nor the last time Presbyterians at a General Assembly meeting would engage slavery, but this particular occasion presented one of the clearest opportunities for for the denomination to answer important questions about where the PCUSA stood on slavery and what kind of Christianity it would indeed profess and practice. On May 19th, the meeting began at 11 a.m. in the morning with a worship service. William W. Phillips, a white pastor of First Presbyterian in New York City and moderator of the previous year's General Assembly, preached from Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, a text emphasizing that Christians must not be ashamed of the gospel and imploring the just to live by faith. Yet some Presbyterians were in fact deeply ashamed of their denomination's reluctance to participate in movements for the emancipation of enslaved Black persons. In 1835, the Chillicothe Presbytery in Ohio sent a letter to other presbyteries, beseeching them to adopt its resolutions on slavery. The members of the Chillicothe Presbytery were aware that some of their fellow Presbyterians, even in northern states that had abolished slavery, either demurred on or outright declined to address slavery because they said that they understood it as a political matter outside the spiritual jurisdiction of their church. In response, the Chillicothe Presbytery found slavery to be a heinous sin and scandal, demanding action from all Presbyterians because, in their words, their church's purity and prosperity was at stake. One of the Presbytery's most controversial recommendations was more stringent disciplinary measure against slave-owning members, such as suspension from the Lord's Supper, a significant sacrament within the Presbyterian tradition. Although the General Assembly in 1818 declared that slavery was a, quote, gross violation of human rights and totally irreconcilable with the spirit and principles of the gospel of Christ, end quote, the exhortation to exercise forbearance toward enslavers in the same resolution resulted in no concrete actions toward Black liberation and produced the kind of Christianity that the Chillicothe Presbytery could no longer tolerate. But the commissioners in 1836 ultimately decided that the question of slavery be indefinitely postponed for three reasons. One, they said the interpretation of the PCUSA Constitution prevented the construction of new ecclesial laws binding the individual conscience. The second reason was the urgency of other remaining business, in their words. And again, third, in their words, the shortness of time permitting to deliberate and decide judiciously on the subject of slavery, end quote. Even though I will note that the duration of their meeting was 2.5 weeks, not days, but weeks. So where was the PCUSA when over 2 million enslaved Black persons were being abused, raped, and oppressed? In 1836, 2 weeks after his sermon, exhorting fellow Presbyterians to practice their faith as unashamed ambassadors of the gospel, William W. Phillips voted in favor of an indefinite postponement on any discussion and decision regarding slavery. One of the commissioners from the Chillicothe Presbytery, John Rankin, voted in opposition to the indefinite postponement. Rankin was a white pastor of a Presbyterian congregation in Ripley, Ohio, and 2 months after his vote, he accepted a position to serve as an agent of the American Anti-Slavery Society, an abolitionist organization founded in 1833 that advocated for the immediate emancipation of enslaved persons. One of its founders, William Lloyd Garrison, observed in 1832 that white Christians in the U.S. were guilty of racial prejudice against Black persons and their discriminatory attitudes and actions toward free Black Americans and their participation in Black enslavement. Garrison believed white congregations and denominations like the PCUSA required a purification as by fire, in his words, because of their resistance to the cause of abolition, their reluctance to denounce enslavers within their ecclesial bodies, and their positioning of the, quote, sanctity of religion, end quote, as a mantle to obscure the sin of slavery. In 1824 and 25, John Rankin published a series of 21 abolitionist letters in a local newspaper. Rankin's immediate audience was his brother Thomas, who had purchased enslaved persons in Virginia. But Rankin desired to publish his letters in a broader effort to present his arguments against both slavery and anti-Black racism. Rankin, as a Presbyterian minister, asked his brother and all white Americans to confront the dehumanizing and oppressive evils of slavery. For Rankin's understanding of Christianity entailed a God who created all human beings as equal, such that persons of African descent were not naturally or providentially inferior to persons of European descent, as some white Presbyterians and other Christians believed. And Rankin called for an honest accounting of the physical abuse, sexual violence, spiritual oppression, and family separation that enslaved persons experienced. Pastor also noted how slavery was destroying the moral integrity of white persons for the ways it permitted, if not promoted, the depravity of enslavers and their cruel treatment of enslaved persons. One of the many criticisms Rankin detailed was the sinful reality that, quote, every slaveholder has power to strip his female slaves, and thousands of them are base enough to put such power into exercise, end quote. A commissioner from the Hopewell Presbytery in Georgia, Eugenius A. Nisbet, also voted in opposition to the indefinite postponement, but for different reasons from Rankin's. Nisbet was a white ruling elder with significant influence in his state's legislature and jurisprudence as a politician, lawyer, and judge. In 1836, Nisbet's career was on the rise as a state senator who was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives 3 years later, and the Supreme Court of Georgia in 1845. Although Nisbet likely agreed with Rankin that the indefinite postponement of any action on slavery lacked clarity and courage, Nisbet actually desired for the PCUSA to adopt a stronger position with an unequivocal defense of slavery and a firm rebuke of the abolitionists within and beyond their church. 2 months before the General Assembly meeting, Nisbet's presbytery gathered to prepare for the forthcoming deliberations on slavery in Pittsburgh. His presbytery designated its own committee to construct a report with, quote, instructions to commissioners to General Assembly, end quote. The members of the Hopewell Presbytery in Georgia maintained that, quote, no instance can be produced of an otherwise orderly Christian being reproved, much less excommunicated from the church for the single act of holding domestic slaves from the days of Abraham down to the date of the modern abolitionists, end quote. The presbytery also resolved that the General Assembly lacked the ecclesial authority to interfere with the political institution of slavery, and that any such interference, including changes to Presbyterian church polity, would be interpreted as, quote, tyrannical and odious. Nisbet was encouraged to, quote, use all Christian means to prevent the discussion of domestic slavery in the assembly, and protest in her name against all acts that involve or approve abolition. And returning to one of Katie Geneva Cannon's searing questions about what kind of Christianity allowed white Christians to deny basic human rights and simple dignity to Black persons, the most obvious answer is the wrong kind of Christianity. In 1845, Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved Black man who escaped as enslaver in Maryland, differentiated between genuine Christianity and the, quote, in his words, corrupt, slave-holding, woman-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land, end quote, in his autobiographical narrative. In the years following his autobiography, Douglass emerged as one of the most prominent abolitionists, intellectuals, and social reformers of the 19th century. Like Douglass, we too are, quote, filled with unutterable loathing, end quote, when we confront the history of slavery, anti-Black racism, and Presbyterianism in the United States. Nearly 20 years after John Rankin published his letters on the immoralities of slavery and anti-Black racism, Douglass wrote that the horrible inconsistencies among white Christians continued. Some white congregations included in their membership enslavers who physically abused and sexually violated enslaved persons. White Christians upholding marriage and family as divine blessings denied millions of enslaved persons these basic human rights, with the absence of laws protecting enslaved marriages and families from separation and auctions, sales, and transfers. Douglass asserted, quote, the warm defender of the sacredness of the family relation is the same that scatters whole families, sundering husbands and wives, parents and children, sisters and brothers, leaving the hut vacant and the hearth desolate, end quote. In the same year of Frederick Douglass's autobiography, a journal published by the Associate Reform Synod of the West lambasted Columbia Theological Seminary for benefiting from a public auction of enslaved persons. The journal found it tragic to see human beings listed as property, akin to animals, lands, and other capital in a local Savannah newspaper. But it was especially infuriated to behold a Presbyterian seminary in the listing as the recipient of the funds derived from the sale. The journal criticized the lack of shame or remorse from the seminary as, quote, scandalous, end quote. While the wrong kind of Christianity is the most obvious answer to Cannon's question, my book maintains that a more historically precise and honest answer is the Presbyterian kind of Christianity. White Presbyterians actively participated in the enslavement of Black persons and the perpetuation of anti-Black racism. Individual members and congregations owned enslaved persons. All these Presbyterians unjustly profited off the uncompensated labor of enslaved persons. Some of these Presbyterians, including pastors, are guilty of committing acts of physical, psychological, sexual, and spiritual abuse against enslaved persons. Elizabeth Keckley, a formerly enslaved Black woman with a successful career as an artisan, including a stint working in the White House as a seamstress for First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, recounted the cruel oppression she experienced from a family of Presbyterian enslavers. Keckley received her first beating at the age of 4, and it was a lashing so severe that she never forgot the incident. Even more painful was when Keckley's father was separated from her and her mother, forced to migrate westward with another enslaver. At the age of 14, Keckley herself was separated from her mother to live with her enslaver's son, a white Presbyterian pastor named Robert Burwell in Virginia. 4 years later, in approximately 1835, Keckley moved with Burwell to Hillsborough, North Carolina, and experienced physical abuse at the hands of both Burwell and a white school principal who was a member of Burwell's congregation. At the behest of Burwell's wife, who sought to subdue what she regarded as Keckley's haughty and proud, arrogant spirit. Burwell and the school principal whipped Keckley on multiple occasions. The school principal also forcibly stripped Keckley naked. Shortly thereafter, Keckley was raped by another white man, Alexander Kirkland, resulting in her pregnancy and the birth of a child. I believe it is incorrect to present Presbyterians as divided over slavery, such that we imagine in our minds today a grand drama with righteous abolitionists incrementally persuading enslavers and enablers of slavery to join their cause in hallowed Presbyterian church buildings across the nation. A more accurate representation is what Angelina Emily Grimke experienced in her short time as a Presbyterian in Charleston, South Carolina. After leaving her family's Episcopal church in protest of its religious teachings, Grimke joined a local Presbyterian congregation for a minute. She initially relished and enjoyed the church's ministry, experiencing growth in her faith and spirituality. But with this growth came stronger convictions that slavery was irreconcilable with the Christian faith. Grimke shared these concerns first with the pastor, who told her that he agreed with her, but that the most faithful response was to, quote, pray and wait, end quote. Dissatisfied with the pastor's counsel, Grimke approached the church's session. These ruling elders, all of whom were enslavers, noted Grimke's young age and also encouraged her to wait. But these elders also disagreed with Grimke and told her that she would soon learn to see the wisdom of slavery as she matured out of her childish naivete into adulthood. Grimke soon thereafter decided to leave the Presbyterian congregation. The pastor and other church members tried to convince Grimke to remain, in no small part because her family was wealthy and among the elite in Charleston. But Grimke simply refused to remain in a pro-slavery congregation. The examples of Presbyterian abolitionists, such as John Rankin and James W.C. Pennington, are sometimes employed to advance the notion that Presbyterianism in the age of slavery is best understood as divided between abolitionists on one side and enslavers on the other. Pennington escaped his enslaver in Maryland and became the first Black student at Yale Divinity School. Pennington attended lectures there for 2 years, but he was not permitted to officially enroll as a student or speak in the classroom. He later served as a pastor in Connecticut and New York, published several books and essays, and received an honorary doctorate from the University of Heidelberg in Germany. But Pennington was more influential outside of Presbyterianism than within it. During his years as a Presbyterian pastor, he grew frustrated with his denomination for its reluctance to act more decisively to end slavery, and he experienced racial prejudice from white members of his presbytery. Although the abolitionist side with faithful Presbyterians like Pennington is certainly worthy of our attention today, I believe the heavy imbalance in how we remember the past leaves us with the wrong impression. These black and white Presbyterian abolitionists were in fact deeply unpopular and received little to no support in the larger Presbyterian church. They were not elected to positions of church authority, and their voices carried little weight among other white Presbyterians. Archibald Alexander, a white professor at Princeton Seminary, now he was the kind of leader that a lot of Presbyterians listened to and supported. But Alexander endorsed the colonization movement to send free Black Americans to Liberia because he felt the discriminatory contempt white Christians held against Black people was too insurmountable to overcome. In 1846, Alexander confessed that anti-Black racism was wrong and unreasonable, but he did not commit to work toward racial equality. Instead of teaching white Christians to repent of their sins of racial prejudice, Alexander preferred that Black Americans, once they were all emancipated, leave the country and find another home on the African continent where their skin color would not be so despised. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison, in the inaugural issue of The Liberator, explained that the aim of his abolitionist newspaper was to, quote, strenuously contend for the immediate enfranchisement of our slave population, end quote, adding that he would not apologize for his use of abrasive and accusatory language, which some white Christians, including Presbyterians like Archibald Alexander, found inflammatory and unchristlike. Yet Garrison deemed it necessary to, quote, be as harsh as truth, end quote, and he hated the kind of Christianity that appealed to gradual abolition, African colonization to Liberia, and other moderate compromises. In his editorial, he wrote, "Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hand of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present," end quote. But white Presbyterians would not relent in prioritizing their church unity over Black liberation. William Wells Brown, a formerly enslaved Black man and one of the most accomplished authors in the 19th century, recalled his encounters with the white pastor of his enslaver's Presbyterian congregation. Brown found that the whole aim of the pastor's ministry was to please the enslavers in the church. He wrote, "When they wanted singing, the pastor he sung. When they wanted praying, he prayed. When they wanted a story told, he told a story," end quote. Brown concluded that this pastor did not teach any Christian theology to the slave-owning church members, but instead, quote, "My master taught theology to him," end quote. In 1851, one white abolitionist, John Gregg Fee, warned his fellow Presbyterians that their ongoing participation in slavery would result in the demise and ruin of their Christian witness. He wrote, "A church that can sanction and fellowship one of the greatest outrages upon humanity, they feel to be worse than no church, a delusion, a den of wolves, where the lambs of the flock are in danger of being devoured," end quote. Unfortunately, what I found as an historian is that too few white Presbyterians then shared Pastor Fee's outrage and heeded his counsel. And I believe what we're wrestling with is all Presbyterians that today we continue to live with the consequences. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. That's what I've got there. And I'm going to open it up and say hi to everyone who's there. Dr. Dixon, it's nice to see you and your students. I hope everyone is still there. I think I met my mark in terms of time.
Hey, Fred, real quick, your microphone sounds terrible on our end. Nope, it's still sounding pretty scratchy. I don't know if you could join from a phone, maybe, or somebody's computer there. If you put it in the chat too, I could just read the questions. Yeah, it's pretty bad. Hold on, I'm about to be unmuted. Yeah, I'm gonna mute this one. I'm gonna add you to the stream.
There we go.
Okay, now.
Okay.
All right.
It's getting a bad echo, but it's better than the static we had before.
Now.
Dr. Yu, in the meantime, I had a question. I was wondering, you said for a long time the church tried to keep spiritual and political issues separate. I'm wondering if you ever really can divorce spiritual and political beliefs, and if we sort of see that legacy continue in modern churches or presbyteries.
Oh, thanks, Toby. That's a great question. Do we still have the room? I don't want to answer it if we don't have the room. Okay, it looks like we do, right, Toby? Great. So let me go ahead while we hopefully figure all that out, because I think this is a question probably some have. I do think, so I think there is ongoing, ongoing division and lively debate about the role of politics in churches and congregations. I do think for Presbyterians then and other Christians and other traditions and denominations, it did arise in this period of, let's say, especially 1830 to 1860 in the what's known as the second wave of abolitionism in the United States and more political engagement of abolitionists. There was this notion of we need to separate and divide spiritual matters and political matters that became known in Presbyterianism and in other Christian churches as this doctrine, the spirituality of the church, that the best way for the church to remain pure is to be free of political involvement, because political involvement could perhaps corrupt or distract from teaching God's word in the Bible and doing what they would define as spiritual ministry. I think what is difficult for me as an historian as I wrestle with this, and I recognize there are differences of opinions on all sides, is to note, I think historically, that if we're thinking about chicken and egg and what came first, I do think this doctrine emerged out of pro-slavery perspectives. That this doctrine really came from wanting to preserve and perpetuate slavery. That really is the birth of this doctrine and this really strict stance of churches to remain free from politics. And I think what's difficult, though, is to define what is politics and what is human rights. Or even in the realm of politics, and then we'll try again with the sound there. Even then, let's say 1820s to 1860s, it was permeable in terms of what was permissible for the church to engage in. So many preachers, particularly in the slaveholding states, they could not preach about slavery and abolition, but they could preach about temperance. They could preach about the dangers of alcohol and alcoholism and why churches needed to get involved in this matter and support political movements for temperance. They also supported the Sabbatarian or the Sabbath movement, to really protect Sunday as, in their view, what they saw as a holy day. And in fact, one of the things that they really were lobbying for was restriction on post-mail service on Sunday, because they lived in an era where receiving mail and letters was the primary mode of communication, and they did not want that to distract from Sunday and from worship. So on protecting the Sabbath and on temperance, it seemed permissible for pastors to preach and talk about these things from the pulpit, but it was not permissible to talk about slavery. So even then, I think the lines between what was and was not permissible and what was political or what was appropriate, what was not, I think every congregation was defining it for themselves. And I think we need to be honest about what happened then and even perhaps what's going on now.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, that's good. Thanks, Dr. Dixon.
Okay, so I wanted to get back to the question, Dr. Yu. The question in itself, as you gave us this timeline, which was empirically correct, we thank you for that. My question is, when you talked about one of the Grimke sisters and her stance as far as leaving the church, was there a stance that was taken by the Transcendentalists? And more specifically, did we hear anything written by Henry David Thoreau on the subject?
So I know a little bit. Maybe Dr. Dixon, you can help me and know more about it. I do think one struggle that the abolitionist movement had from 1830, even up until the Civil War, was their demand and their desire and what they believed would motivate and help the movement in moral suasion, as they understood it, was to get Christian denominations, whether it be the Unitarians, the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians. Transcendentalists were part of several movements, but it really was trying to get entire churches and denominations to be willing to excommunicate enslavers and supporters of slavery from their denominations. It was, as you saw from John Gregg Fee, this idea of non-fellowship or no fellowship. You have to exclude those who support slavery and especially enslavers from the Christian church. You have to say you cannot support and you cannot be an enslaver and be Christian. So there were some pastors who believed it. There were some congregations who believed it, but it was difficult even among the many of the, what we would say, progressive kind of denominations to get entire denominations to go with that. Some smaller denominations, such as the Free Presbyterian Church, which John Rankin helped to start. There are a few Wesleyan churches that did this, the Reformed Presbyterians, but they really struggled with moving from individuals to larger ecclesial groups. Oh, did I lose the room?
So, Dr. Yu, there was a question about the, if you will, the hypocrisy between the questioning of the role of prayer and, if you will, inaction towards the abolishment of slavery. Can you give us your thoughts on that?
Yes, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts too, Dr. Dixon. Let me go first, hopefully briefly. I think there were several abolitionists that I studied, such as Gerrit Smith, who was a layperson, a merchant, a businessman in New York in his day. He was deeply critical of some Christians and some Christian pastors and theologians advocating for prayer as the best solution for slavery. He thought that was dishonest, because how could there be prayer without action? So he really questioned whether they really were praying for the end of slavery. And he also noted that, and others noted, they were critical that some of the prayers were for solutions to the problem of slavery, if you will, that would not disrupt the social and economic foundations of America, of the United States. And so it was this question of, what are we really praying for? Because prayer, what is prayer without action? It is empty and it is hollow. So that was what some abolitionists were critical about, the kind of notion of praying is the best solution for slavery.
Okay. Well, I think about the abolitionists and these layered nuances or the populations inside of the abolitionist movement. And I think about the women, and I think about the Grimke sisters and those kinds of people. And more so, I believe it's very important for you, when we can, that you can give us your thoughts on the role of women in abolition as this ties to this particular issue.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Dr. Dixon. You're right. Angelina, Sarah, Emily Grimke, Sarah Grimke, Maria W. Stewart, particularly in her, I think she's recognized as the first Black political activist, giving the first kind of what were known as political speeches in Boston in the early 1830s.
Who did you say again?
Maria Stewart.
Mariah.
Yes, Stewart. Yes.
Mariah Stewart.
Yes.
She says, "What if I am a woman?"
Yes. And so I think it is to note that women were active in abolitionism. Women were also active in pro-slavery too, Dr. Dixon.
Absolutely.
I do think it was what divided the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1840. So they were, such as William Lloyd Garrison and others, they were increasingly, I guess what we would say intersectional, Dr. Dixon, in noting that in addition to or alongside abolition of slavery, alongside ending racial discrimination, there was a desire to promote women's rights and to honor, at a micro level, honor the women who were active in the American Anti-Slavery Society, even electing them to the executive committee. I think they elected 3 women in 1840. And out of that actually came a divide. The motion barely passed with a majority. And most of those in the minority, let's say it was around 40%, they actually left the American Anti-Slavery Society to form another abolitionist movement. They called themselves the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. So you had a AASS, the original group, and you had a AFASS for these two movements. And really the divide was over. So one level, some were sexist, some of these abolitionists. They did not believe women should hold positions of authority and power in the public sphere and in churches too. But for others who were not sexist, their concern was that they thought that the intersectionality and the push for women's rights would distract from abolition. They were particularly mindful, Dr. Dixon, that the people that they wanted to persuade, traditional Christians, Protestants who were Methodist and Baptist and Presbyterian and the like, they knew that these Christians did not support the equality of women in church and society. So they did not want to, lose them. They thought, let's take care of abolition first, and then we can work on other issues. So there was that divide. But I think what we can note historically is to note the powerful example of women really being leaders. And for many of these women, finding their voice and finding their authority and finding their place equal alongside men, it really was through their abolitionist activism that they also saw a role for themselves as women. But Dr. Dixon, you'll also note that there was some racism even within white feminism in the 1840s and 1850s, such that Sojourner Truth was deeply critical of white feminist movements that were not intersectional and thinking about race. So all of that was certainly there as well.
I think you make a great point that we should, particularly the young scholars, should begin to be able to dismantle this idea of abolitionists being lumped together and not having layered nuances. I think about Henry Lloyd Garrison, and Henry Lloyd Garrison's ideas were very marginalizing sometimes when it came to Frederick Douglass's trajectory. In fact, he did not believe that Frederick Douglass should start his own newspaper, the North Star. So those things have to be looked to, particularly for those folks who are looking for clarity, as a way to look at an overarching belief that even in abolitionism, there was this undergirding, this underbelief that said that there was an innate inferiority of blacks.
You're right. Thanks, Dr. Dixon. I do know Angelina Emily Grimke herself too, and Lewis and Arthur Tappan, Tappan. They were these leading abolitionists. They noted that they noted that we are supporting the immediate abolition of and the end of slavery, but at the same time they confessed their own racism. That Angelina Emily Grimke, she asked the African-American abolitionists that she worked alongside for forbearance. She noted and asked them to forgive her and other leading white abolitionists for their racism against Black people because it was so pervasive in their society. And Angelina Emily Grimke asked her African-American colleagues, please stay with us. Even though you have to forgive us and you have to forbear and you have to be patient with us, because the only way that we are going to be free of our own racism, even as we support the end of slavery, is to be in social and spiritual fellowship with Black people. So that was that's another nuanced layer. I liked how you said that, Dr. Dixon, about the movement.
Dr. Yu, one of the people in attendance has a question about your discussion about prayer and action. And the question is, what is the action that you would like to see churches taking with respect to racism today?
Well, Reverend McDaniel, I'll let you answer that too, because you are leading a congregation that is, as you noted, a Matthew 25 congregation that is seeking to eradicate racism at local, state, and federal layers. I think for me it is. So the first thing I would say is that prayer requires confession and confrontation. That it is a confession of our sins, and it is asking God to help us confront those sins and those biases and those prejudices and those comforts, perhaps, right, Pastor McDaniel, that are keeping us from being the best disciples of Jesus Christ that we can be. So for me, it's instead of beginning with kind of general, even I'm going to say this, Pastor McDaniel, I might get in a little trouble, even generic prayers about the problems of climate change and wars all over the world in Ukraine and elsewhere and the like, and racism at home. It is to say, like, what do these words mean? And how can God truly transform my heart, my mind, our hearts and our minds? And how can we ultimately have prayers that allow us to act in a certain way? And the last thing I'll say, Pastor McDaniel, is that in the United States, we're a Republican democracy or a democratic republic, either way you put it. So for change to happen, certainly some of it needs to happen at the level of informal friendships and charitable action, but some of it also actually has to happen through political involvement. And so we've got to figure out a way in our churches to talk about how to be engaged and thoughtful politically and working together to come up with political solutions to our problems.
As a follow-up, a last question, when I read your book, I had been struggling with this question of why has there been this resurgence in racism? Up until 6 or 7 years ago, we thought we were moving in the right direction. And in the last 6 years, it seems that there's been this great reversal. And I kept struggling with why that had happened. And after reading your book, it hit me that people today are the last of generation after generation after generation going back to the 17th century who have sat in pews and heard racist sermons and teachings and had theology interpreted in a way that made them feel comfortable about owning slaves. And so now we're still dealing with the refusal of many pastors to preach or teach about racism yet today. And the church really, in my view, to join in the answer that you just gave, the church in this environment has to be the foundation for teaching a new direction on racial issues. And your book helped me to see that the long history of the church is why we're here today. And I think in our society, it's the church that can help over a few generations pull us out of that abyss.
Oh, thank you, Pastor McDaniel. I affirm, yes, I agree with you both on the diagnosis and the prescription for a more genuinely hopeful present and future. I do think one thing I will say to you, Reverend McDaniel, is one challenge I think is, what does effective incremental change look like? I do think it's difficult for clergy, for any leaders in any movement, to be 5 steps ahead of the people that they want to lead. Because it's like you're shouting from a distance, hey, follow me and let's do this. It really requires being only 1 step ahead or alongside. I think that's the kind of leadership we want. You want to probably do in your church. I want to do at my seminary. Like, how do we do it incrementally in ways that are effective, in ways that are work, but in ways that are not moderate? You know what I mean? In ways that are not watered down. I think there's a real tightrope between incremental change and like compromised like conviction. Do you know what I mean? I don't know how you wrestle with that in your ministry.
Well, I think the way I wrestle with it is that it's a significant part of my teaching. And I think you have to make if that's the direction you want your congregation to go, staying, like you said, only 1 or 2 steps ahead requires teaching at that level, and to not fear the reaction to talking about difficult questions like this. Well, Dr. Yu, I want to thank you for being with us tonight, and I want to thank Dr. Frederick Douglass Dixon and his students. We're here at the University of Wyoming with them, and certainly have enjoyed our evening and our conversation with them. I want to thank the Wyoming Presbytery for helping us to promote this discussion. I do hope that those who have joined us will read your book. I think it's really an important contribution to the church in terms of what it needs to understand in order to move in the direction it needs to move. So thank you, Dr. Yu, for your excellent research and your writing and your presentation tonight.
Oh, thank you very much, Pastor McDaniel. And thank you very much to Dr. Dixon and to others. I'm sorry that I don't know all your names. It's a little harder virtually. You don't have that in-between time or before time to really shake hands and say hello. And I know you all were discussing President Lincoln, right, beforehand. And how genuinely was President Lincoln an abolitionist? I know y'all covered that before I got on with y'all.
Yeah, and then Dr. Dixon moved on to Andrew Johnson. So.
Oh, okay.
Well, thank you, and thanks to the audience for being here, and for Dr. Dixon for the facility. Good night, everybody.